Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Murray Feldman from WWJ News Radio 950, and once again, we are honored to be a co-sponsor of the Executive Speaker Series here at the University of Michigan-Dearborn. It's been a great season. We've had two wonderful discussions and debates. Today is going to be another very worthwhile one because we're talking about a very, very important topic, a topic that is in the news every day. It'll probably change news-wise before the end of this day, and it's very important to businesses, and we're talking about global commerce. The question is, you have to be there, but can you afford to be there with what's going on and the changes that are going on? It's a great discussion. To lead us off, let me introduce to you the Dean of the College of Business here at the University of Michigan-Dearborn, Dr. Raju Balakrishnan.
Thank you, Murray. We are equally thrilled to have WWJAM 950 as a partner in this significant executive speaker series. Good morning. And let me add my own welcome to all of you to the third and final event of the 2018-2019 College of Business Executive Speaker Series. The series is now in its 8th year and has been continuing to grow not only in its popularity, but in its impact because of the kind of topics we discuss. In that regard, today's topic for the speaker series is yet another timely one, as Murray mentioned. The topic is selling in the global economy, how U.S. businesses can thrive. And when you talk about global economy, I think that's a message we constantly try to impart on our students, that as they are getting ready to graduate and start competing for jobs, their competition is not in their classroom, in this university, or even in the state or country. Their competition is probably sitting halfway across the world, claiming that they can do that job better and cheaper than them. And that's kind of the same thing that is happening in industry when it comes to selling in the global marketplace. How do you constantly compete? Global trade statistics show that the U.S. is number 2 in the world in exports, number 1 in the world in imports, but somewhere near the last in our trade imbalance, with imports from China equal to 4 times what we export to China. However, strategies for growth are complicated in the global marketplace. For example, many U.S. companies have struggled with their communications among different nationalities, cultures, genders, and age groups. In addition, U.S. companies must navigate trade-related issues, tariffs, which has been a hot topic of late, differences in legal systems, and challenges by some countries requiring local partnerships when a U.S. company sets up an operation there. The purpose of today's panel is to discuss the future of selling U.S. goods and services in the global marketplace. What political and legal issues do U.S. businesses face? How can they satisfy a wide range of consumers and businesses around the world? What new marketing methods and technologies will help U.S. companies communicate in the global marketplace? And finally, how can U.S. companies obtain a level trading field while protecting their intellectual and technological properties? Clearly, this should be a very interesting discussion, and we have 3 high-profile panelists today whom Murray will introduce to you shortly. So at this stage, without further ado, let me again thank you all for being here today and turn the stage back over to Murray for the introductions.
Thank you very much, Dean. Yeah, this is a great panel, and everybody who was on the panel is really on the front line of what's going on today in the global marketplace. Let me welcome in Johan de Nijssen, former president of Cadillac, having worked in 4 countries with more than 30 years of automotive experience. He has well-informed perspectives on the future of personal mobility, but also consumer behavior. Before joining General Motors, he served as the president of Audi Japan, president of Audi of America, and the global president of the Infiniti Motor Company. In December of 2018, he was appointed as the director of Guidant Limited, an investment group focused on creating marketplace value from university-developed technology and technologies. Thank you so much for being here, Johan. Frank O'Brien is the Executive Vice President of Magna International, where he's responsible for business development with Asian automakers. In addition, he oversees sales training for the global sales force and manages the company's business systems department. Throughout his 17 years with Magna International, he's held positions as the Vice President of Global Sales and Marketing and Vice President of Strategy and Planning. In addition, he's a member of the Society of Automotive Engineers and is the holder of several U.S. patents. Frank, thank you so much for being here.
Morning,
Welcome.
thank you.
Chris Sanfilippo is the founder of Market Spark, a marketing communications firm specializing in startup ventures. He's also a collegiate lecturer of marketing at University of Michigan-Dearborn. He has authored a marketing textbook and has lectured internationally on the relationship between management, branding, supply chain management. And before joining U of M Dearborn, he spent 10 years with Alpha Omega Communications, where he served as the manager of the Ford commercial truck account. In addition, he's also a member of the Allen Park Downtown Development Authority Marketing Committee. Chris, we're happy to have you here. Thank you so much. And Dr. Brian Green is a CPA, full professor, and the Zarnicki Collegiate Professor of Accounting. He earned his PhD in 1991 from Kent State University. Since that time, he's received many honors, including both the Michigan Associate of CPA's Distinguished Achievement in Accounting Education and the Accounting Educator of the Year Awards, the College of Business's Distinguished Researcher and Teacher of the Year Awards, also the university's Distinguished Faculty Research and Distinguished Teaching Awards. He's also the founder and the director of the Executive Speaker Series. We welcome him up to the podium because he has a great panel waiting for him. Thank you so much.
Just like the classroom, no one wants to sit in that front row right there. So, good morning. We do have a good panel here, and it was actually difficult to develop questions for this panel because they have such diverse backgrounds and opinions, and I'm hoping they all come through. But I want to start with more of a basic question to get us started here, and that is, how has the change in technology changed access to global markets, whether it's small, medium, or large businesses, whether it's B2C or B2B, but how has that changed the way things are done, especially in the past 5 years?
Sure. Well, interesting. We've always talked in marketing about the difference between high tech and high touch. And of course, in dealing with different cultures, in selling, and I think Frank will address this as well, in selling in different cultures, it's all about touch. It's all about going in and understanding the nuance of the culture and then finessing that part. It's not something necessarily that, at least as the technology sits right now, AI can do for us. So it's going to be interesting to see how that process evolves so that it becomes, so that we can use high tech in high touch situations such as global sales and so forth.
I would perhaps just add that it also depends on probably which industry you're referring to. Fast-moving consumer goods may be one thing. If you do, looking at the industry that I have experience of, the automotive industry, of course technology influences everything we do. But to the particular point of access to markets, there continue to be the normal barriers to entry in terms of regulatory requirements, the need to homologate vehicles, set up distribution networks, and so on, and that has fundamentally remained unchanged.
Yeah, I think the biggest impact has been the speed at which people can access information. Marketing is all about push and pull. So you got the pull from the consumer, and then you got the push from the supplier. And it's much easier now to find out what the regulations are. For the Chinese, for example, they can easily find out how to do business in North America, whereas in 20 years ago, it was very difficult for them to access that. So, I think the level at which each culture is up to speed in terms of modern information and access to that information determines a lot about the speed at which they can access market. And of course, speed is really important, because if you want to be first to market, you really have to be first, because somebody else is right on your heels.
Branding, I think, Brian, if I may add one more thing, branding has helped us. Branding is at its heart a shortcut, really, for most of us. We always default to a certain brand that we use perhaps as a child, or growing up. And branding resonates across both cultures and across borders. And so I think that may help us to adopt products for other cultures and countries to adopt products readily.
Well, you and I talked about this earlier, but how do companies maintain like a branding consistency across cultures when they want to be recognized worldwide, but having one consistent brand across all cultures? How do they handle that mix?
It's difficult. It has to start, I think, at a very basic level. So a company doesn't necessarily, it seems like it's more difficult. It is done. We saw that with the Coca-Cola. We see that with the new Coca-Cola campaign, where we're not selling soda pop anymore, which is nothing more than the commodity of sugar water with a caramel color that has a fizzy bite to it, right? But now we're selling friendship and happiness. And these are things that resonate across cultures. When you think of a Coke, you think of happiness. I have a doctor friend who's a thoracic surgeon, one of these grizzled guys. He's been doing this for 40 years. He won't retire. And if he goes in and he talks to a patient and the patient's feeling a little blue after surgery, he tells the nurse, give him a Coke. So this sort of thing sort of resonates across cultures. Now, in terms of taking a brand, a global brand locally, it really requires that basic understanding from the ground up, built into the product or the service, so that it can evolve to a global brand. The new terminology, by the way, I think my students will agree, is glocal. So we're talking about going glocal with our brands.
I would really endorse that fully and add that specifically in the luxury goods domain and for high-priced capital goods like automobiles, branding is crucial. And the world has become a global village. And so while it's true that there are regional and cultural differences that have to be taken into account, the successful brands are those who really understand, firstly, who their target audience is and who have successfully segmented the markets and positioned their brands consistently around the world so that a BMW on the streets of Tokyo is perceived in the same way on the streets of Shanghai as New York, as Paris. You might have to recognize that the local or global consideration is to take into account unique tastes that may exist in the specific market that you're operating in. There's a difference between China and the US. But in terms of brand standards, the way the brand is positioned, the price position, the marketing communication tone and manner, and the physical manifestation, the look and feel of the adverts, the look and feel of the dealerships, that is all consistent. And that is an important part of what luxury consumers buy into, because they're all internationally mobile and they want to recognize the brands they are familiar with and favor equally, no matter what part of the world they're in.
Yeah, as a supplier, branding is not something that we really get involved in, but it does cause us a lot of headaches. For example, Ward's Automotive estimated last week that by 2025 there will be 245 electric vehicle models in China. So the headache for us is, all the companies that are producing those, there's the traditional companies which are edging in, but there's a plethora of actually over 200 small startup companies who are all trying to create a brand. Which ones will succeed is a headache for us. I mean, our business has been very traditional in that we've known exactly who our customers are. There's a list of global brands, global automotive companies. So we've never really had to get in and assess whether or not we should do business with somebody. It's all been a question of scale, size, where your plant is located. Now with all the entrants to the electric vehicle market, we've got it every week almost a new company coming in asking to do business with us, and we're scratching our heads to say, well, will they succeed? Will they develop a brand? Will they be able to afford to have the next model? Because automotive is a very expensive business. So we're becoming more and more involved in trying to assess whether our customer can be successful with the consumer over a long period of time. And our payback is on our capital is a long process. We have to have a couple of models in the life cycle to justify the capital investment. So will company A beat company B, beat company C? Will they be around in 8-10 years? Those are the headaches that we have, and bringing us into meeting people like Chris who understand global marketing from the OEM side.
Attached to the little flyer about the event today is a index card and all of a pen. If you have a question later on in the session, our student assistants will pick those up and bring them forward to me, and I will group into like questions and ask the panel your questions later on. So just so you know, they're there. Before we get into a little more automotive specific, I want to ask a very general question. Companies that are entering a global market for the first time, what due diligence should they put forward to assure that their entrance in the global market is successful? What are some things that are common mistakes that companies make entering a country that limits or causes failure? So what is the due diligence that companies should put forth?
Brian, the first thing that comes to mind is, once again, that understanding of the global culture. Because if you think about much of our business, our economy is made up of small businesses here in the United States. If you take a small business, you've got an entrepreneur or you've got a business owner who has his hands full with day-to-day operations, and his business is growing, and is bringing new products to market, and his salespeople are out in the field making mistakes, and then someone suggests that he open and go into a new market to grow. We hear all the time about companies who have growing pains, and this is a problem. This can drive extreme success that comes quickly. I worked for a company where this happened, can drive a company into the ground because the management can't handle that. So due diligence is important. And Brian, to answer your question, I believe that the due diligence comes with that understanding of that global market. People are not the same everywhere. What they will demand from you, I think both of my colleagues will agree with this in their own experience. What the marketplace will demand is far different from one culture to another.
Yeah, I can only endorse that. You know, as was mentioned in my introduction, I've worked for Japanese, German, and American firms. Obviously, can't hold down a job, and it's absolutely consistent. And I don't think it's arrogance, although some people might label it such. But I truly do believe that people tend to view the world through the lens that they are familiar with, and that lens is the lens of home. And they tend to think that the domestic market and their experience is similar to what is going to be the circumstances in the competitive environment and so on, and customer tastes in other markets. What works in Germany doesn't necessarily work in the USA. What works in the USA doesn't necessarily work in China. And so my direct sort of simple response to that question would be, take whatever arrogance and preconceived notions that you have and put them in the trash can. Understand your market, understand the consumer preferences, understand the competitive environment as part of that due diligence process.
Yeah, in our case, again, we supply components, and almost every component on the vehicle. So one of our key questions across those different components is, will the business model work in a particular country? And I'll give you an example of one product area in China. The market opportunity in North America for a large component was basically created by the lack of access to capital or lack of willingness of the OEM to spend the capital on the particular module that we're talking about. So Our opportunity came because they didn't want to spend the money. They wanted us to spend the money. They didn't have the space in the plant. They didn't want to build a new plant. In China, there's unlimited access to capital. That is why there's so much overcapacity in all industries in China. Freely available capital either from the central government or from the provincial governments, and more so from the provincial governments, whose main mandate is to employ as many people as possible. So they just build plants. Then they look for a market after they build the plant. So in the case of those modules, for us, because everybody's got availability of capital, there's no opportunity. So we don't have access to the market because of a capital situation, not because of consumer pull or any of the other factors. So we start with due diligence to see, first of all, will the business model for our particular component area work in a particular culture?
Recently, within the past couple of days, Ford's run into a little difficulty with their tariffs, where they've been bringing in cargo vans with seats in them. And since there were seats in them, they were considered regular vans as opposed to trucks. And they were able to avoid a lot of tariffs with their imports. And tariffs kind of cut both ways. But expanding internationally, U.S. companies have to navigate a host of trade issues, including tariffs. Any comments on the current tariff issue and where you think it's going? And how does that affect businesses when they bring things back into the U.S.?
I'd perhaps again comment from an automotive perspective. Tariffs is obviously a touchy subject at the moment, and I'm not going to comment on the methodology of the discussion. I'm going to comment on why it's needed and the intent behind tariff equalization. In the opening comments, it was referenced the massive trade imbalance between the US and China. And that's just one example. And as a businessman, I believe that we want to have free trade between markets and between countries. And it has to be done on the basis, though, of a win-win outcome. A win-lose outcome is not sustainable, because at some stage, the guy who's losing will have lost to the point where the very market that was being exploited is no longer available. And if you look in particular at the tariff barriers and regulatory barriers which exist, for example, in the Chinese market, automotive related, there are very high import tariffs, varying 40 to 25%. There's a need for having a joint venture partner inside China. Companies cannot go in and manufacture and set up shop on their own. The need for a joint venture partner has obvious implications. It means that there's risk of transfer of technology, intellectual property, and quite clearly also the dilution of profits. A similar situation, not quite as egregious, exists between the USA and Europe. The EU has a 10% import duty. Now, when the vehicles come back here, there is not such a tariff barrier. But barriers aren't only related to tariffs. They also can be administrative barriers. Japan tends to go a little bit in that direction. And so the thesis of having a level playing field, I think, is a fair and justified one. And as I say, I'm not going to comment about how to deliver that, but I do believe it is necessary for companies to be able to enter the market and compete globally on an even playing field.
I think most of us would agree that tariffs are not good, but I think you have to look going forward with the recent activity at a deeper level, because tariffs are only a manifestation of underlying deep differences between different economies. And if you step back to the last question about the due diligence, I mean, people seem to forget that China is not a democracy. China is not a normal capitalist country. It's not a free market economy. It's a centrally planned economy directed by the government which owns a large majority of firms in the country. So if you want to do your due diligence, you get in there and look and see, what is the real status of that economy. So the reason when we have all this tariff discussions now is that people have finally woken up to the fact that we're not competing with the same type of economy as we have in the US. It's a totally different model. And that boils down to the legal system, for example. 70% of judges in China have no legal background. So what does that mean? You can't hire a bunch of attorneys like you would here. You can't predict outcomes. And I think you've got some questions later on intellectual property. You have to think of a whole different structure. If you walk in assuming that it's the same, you've got a problem. So I think tariffs are just bubbling up to the surface. It's just the gas that's coming out of a much deeper undercurrent of differences, and it's becoming relevant now because China has become such a big force. It's a major economy to be tackled, and not one that you can ignore in the international competitive marketplace.
It's really an exciting, interesting discussion at this point, and I'd like to comment on something that Johan said also. First of all, when we think about tariffs, we say, okay, tariffs are, taxes that are placed on goods that come into the country, so that if you're going to buy a Chinese car, it's going to cost you more because there's a tariff slapped on it, and it's going to. So when they start off at a higher price, that in itself has to be at a fair level, and I don't think that's the real issue with regard to our conversation with the Chinese that's going on right now. Right now it's going on. That's why this is so exciting. And I think that Johan addressed it a bit when he said that there's also the intellectual property thing that's happening, right? So when you go over to do business, I'm sort of underscoring this. When you go to do business in China, you're going to ally yourself with a partner who's on the ground in China, and you're going to give up some of your intellectual properties. Now, we would not allow that here. We're very careful about privacy. An owner can't even talk to his family about his what's coming through the pipeline, because we keep that very close to the vest. So in this situation, this is going to be the sticking point. I'm very encouraged when I hear the news reports that we're close to a deal with China, and I think the sticking point is going to be right there, that when we go in, sure, we'll do business over here, but we're not giving up our secrets.
So if I could just perhaps, give a real practical example to you of how these tariffs impact and how they operate in the real world. So firstly, on the question of the intellectual property that we've just touched on, you may say, well, if there's risk to losing key technologies, why would we go into the Chinese Chinese market? Well, if you're a business leader and you decide that you will ignore the Chinese market because of these risks, the Chinese market is so huge in terms of scale that to divorce yourself from the revenue and profit opportunities and growth opportunities for your enterprise could, in fact, in the long run, place an existential threat on your business, because your competitors in the meantime are scaling, they're getting the economies, they're getting all of those things that would give them a competitive advantage in the marketplace. So that's why you go in. It's not just about short-term profit objectives, it's about longer-term strategic considerations. Now, on the issue of tariffs, there's no one-size-fits-all approach. If you're a developing country, you recognize this reality that you don't have the economies of scale, you want to protect local employment, and for those situations it's quite commonplace to have protective barriers to protect local industry from the large, gigantic corporations that would otherwise swamp them if they come in from other markets. If you now take the situation of China, I think most people in this room would tend to agree that China could no longer be considered to be a developing market. And that is also why it's quite appropriate to start having the conversation about these historical barriers to entry, whether they are still justified and appropriate. For an automotive manufacturer today, if you want to compete in China, you have two choices. You either export the cars from your domestic market, your home country, be it the USA or Germany, and you face these very considerable import tariffs, which then means that from a price point of view, you're not competitive. So solution number 2 is to set up manufacturing in China with a joint venture partner, which opens up all of these intellectual property risks, profit dilution, and that I've referenced. But it also means that you are tooling up twice. And you know, the automotive business is massively capital intensive. It's factories, it's development costs, it's developing supply bases, and. If you are an American automotive company, you would tool up and do all of that stuff for the US market that you probably then use as your export base for the rest of the world, as well as your North American business. And you have the double investment in China. I can tell you that car companies around the world would love to integrate the Chinese operations into their global manufacturing footprint. And this is where, if we can level the playing field, it actually becomes a win-win for all parties involved, including the consumer. Because if companies need tool up only once, and you have reverse trade, so one model you can tool up in the US, one model you can tool up in China, and you supply the global market from each of those plants, you can immediately halve your capital investments, and thereby generate efficiencies to the benefit of the consumer as well. So that's why the real practical implications of having this level playing field, I think, is quite important and objective to attain.
Yeah, for suppliers, I think that the situation on tariffs is a little bit different from 10 years ago, because localization has already been pushed very heavily due to the natural disasters in 2011. You had a big earthquake in Japan, and you had a tsunami in Thailand and Southeast Asia. Those brought into play the whole idea of an extended supply chain. So you had situations where a small plant with a tiny little lens for a camera, for example, flooded or destroyed, and vehicle plants in North America shut down. That precipitated a huge trend in OEMs, car companies localizing components in different markets. So the bigger the component, the less likely it is to be exported anymore. And if it impacts the supply chain, in fact, the cost of holding inventories and air shipments, if there's a delay, outweigh the cost benefits of low labor costs in many Asian countries for certain components, and the determinant is typically size. So 10 years ago it would have had a huge impact on us as suppliers, but today not so much.
Looking at supply chain, since you brought it up, what are some other supply chain issues that companies face when they expand their footprint? When we create that distance between who's putting the components together and who's actually manufacturing the components, even with the raw material supply chain coming through, that entire supply chain, how is it affected when we expand out?
Well, I think, first of all, it's the word is supply chain, or the phrase is supply chain, because the supply chain consists of several tiers. And I would say our biggest problem with China, for example, as well as our competitors' biggest problem, is the tier 3, tier 4 suppliers and the quality. In China, at that level, they take shortcuts. They don't adhere to standards. They will supplant one material with another without permission, which ends up down the chain in warranty claims, for vehicles and recalls and all that sort of stuff. So, you got to determine what you're actually going to do yourself, and given the reliability or otherwise, I mean, if you look at a new market like Indonesia, when you go in there, you want to see, is there a supply chain? Does it exist, and who controls it? Because you may have a supply chain controlled by a competitor. So you may have to develop your own supply chain. So the whole thing is totally interrelated at all levels.
To give you a little bit of a perspective from, downstream of Frank's business, so automotive OEM, he explained this incident that happened some years ago with the camera lens. Well, it's not an isolated case, but it did initiate this response where OEMs then took steps to diversify their supply base so that they weren't reliant on one supplier. However, you also learn Because sometimes you think you've diversified, but exactly to this point of getting down to the tier 3 and tier 4 suppliers, so those who will supply your suppliers who supply your suppliers, you end up also potentially not having any diversification. And examples of this relates to a paint pigment manufacturer in Japan who also had problems. And it was discovered that they supplied sort of the majority of the global market for paint pigments. And you can't make cars without paint. It's sort of an essential requirement. And similarly, computer chips and so on. And it would paralyze car plants. And so part of the task now of our supply chain executives is to actually dig in and do the deeper tiers to see who the suppliers are, so you can ensure that you have this diversification. And to the point of quality concerns, you know, China is more and more being integrated into the global supply base, if not so much yet for fully built up products, and definitely for components. And there are cases where the tier 3 and tier 4 suppliers, who are more difficult to manage from a quality perspective, have deviated from the specification of the OEM. I think Aston Martin a while ago had a recall because the brake pedals on the cars were failing. I mean, it's an unusual component to fail. But the manufacturer, it was traced back, had deviated from the specification. And so you can see from that that even there could be real safety impacts from not having this whole quality management process completely locked down as you diversify your supply base around the world.
Quality has been an important part of this question, and one of the things that comes to mind also is that is the sort of the social interaction. So if we outsource some of our activities, for instance, in the 1990s, Nike outsourced some of its manufacturing to all of its manufacturing to the third world, and the people in the third world are used to sending children into the factory to do the work. I mean, and they earn a nice wage for their culture. And so the people in the United States are outraged to find out that there's child labor being abused in Cambodia or Laos or wherever that was. And Phil Knight spent most of the 1990s dealing with that problem. In the end, he finally, I think, got his arms around it because he, you know, because of his promise to go into Nike and be sure that all of the suppliers were complying with social these social norms here. We're selling our products in the United States. And now it's come up again with Nike, you know, in 27, I can't remember now whether it was 2017 or 18, but just recently there was a protest because once again learned that there's sweatshop labor taking place overseas. So there's, excuse me, there's the whole idea of in outsourcing like that to also manage that so that we here, can you imagine if that, that paint manufacturer that's upstream from the OEM for General Motors Buick division, it got out that Buick used that paint, and there was child labor used in that paint shop, what that would mean to the Buick brand. And people don't take time to sort it out. It just sort of snowballs till Buick becomes the devil then, and nobody will buy a Buick. It's very harmful.
Yeah. By the way, that was an illustrative example.
Yes. Thank you for underscoring that.
Just to show you how current we are, we're talking about the cost of imports when you send things out and they come back in, but it was estimated that import prices would go up in February by 0.3%. It actually doubled. It went up by 0.6%. That just came out at 8:35, and I'd like to thank Murray Feldman, who was the business reporter for WOJ, for handing me that. But it actually affects the news today also. We talked a little about quality, but I had this question I didn't know I was going to get to, but I guess I am. Companies that partner outside the U.S. Or build plants outside the U.S. that are foreign controlled. What are some issues, and how do we maintain quality and productivity with those partners and outside suppliers? We talked a little about the brake issue and the paint issue, but what are some things that a U.S. company moving in globally can have some assurance or gain assurance that the quality and productivity maintain similar to U.S. standards. Not at U.S. standards, but similar to U.S. standards at least.
Well, I think you got to know who your partner is, and that's, you're back to due diligence again. You know, you've got to determine whether or not they've got some sort of similar philosophy to you in terms of all aspects of business. But you know, quality is a key one, and you know, you have to get in and look at their plants and see whether or not they're following international standards, or at least high-level standards, and whether or not the senior management is committed. You know, if there's not commitment at the top, you'll have looseness down the system. And, you know, look at the plants and send people that know, they're not just in a conference room, but people that know what's happening in a plant. They can quickly tell whether or not a plant is being run without shortcuts, and people have the patience, because big problem with quality is patience. People want to make money fast, particularly in China. So they take shortcuts. You have to have patience to end up with high-level quality. So it's part of the partnership due diligence process.
I would perhaps also add that from the perspective of an OEM, where you kind of are also the integrator of a whole bunch of components that are supplied by your vendors, but quality starts really from the moment that a vehicle is conceived and engineered and developed. You engineer quality into a car by having specific targets you want to meet. And then it's about ensuring the specifications and the processes that you follow to give this consistent result around the world. And so an automaker has a specific process for the development part of the vehicle, or the component, the design specification that goes into it. And then it has a process for manufacturing. Now, if we look again at this example of OEMs who now also operate in China, for the majority of them, these plants that they have in China are in fact far more modern, because they are newer than the factories they have in their home markets. So they use the latest technology, the latest equipment, but the processes also are very rigorous and consistent with what, you know, is the practice followed in the domestic market. And then, because, for example, again, in China, you do have at presence, because it's a joint venture, you do have your own experts on the ground, and also part of the management to ensure that the processes are followed. In many cases then, in fact, the quality of vehicles produced in China is higher than here, because the processes are the same, the design specifications are the same, and they're being produced more consistently with modern plant equipment. I'm not saying this is a universal truth, but I think that particularly for the automotive OEMs who have, you know, operations in China, the quality of the products coming out of there is pretty much consistent or better than what is happening elsewhere. And that also means that it would be in China's advantage to allow those businesses to be integrated into the global supply chain of the OEMs, because they can, in fact, supply very high quality product to consumers around the world.
Earlier on, we talked about just slightly over the cultural differences in marketing and what an acceptable product would be because of cultural difference. But we also have differences in products because of local regulation, differences in requirements within countries. Can you give a few examples where we have products in the U.S. and then we have a different model of that product that's sold in another country because of either cultural differences or regulation requirements of that local country?
Well, I can give you one example. We actually have a business in China which consists of an engineering service where we adapt vehicles that are designed overseas for the OEMs that have joint ventures that they want, you know, they originate a model and they need to adapt the interior, for example, to Chinese taste. So they determine that the vehicle will not sell because the Chinese want a softer touch to the interior, different feel. A lot of cases with the premium vehicles, the driver is an employee. The important person, the owner of the vehicle, is in the back. So the rear has to be more comfortable than the driver compartment. So, we have had it consistently for the last 15 years, a pretty good business selling engineering services to deal with those differences.
I think also specifically on the point of regulatory impacts, I think the one key word is standardization. Everybody around the world agrees we need standardization. The thing is, everybody wants their standard to be the one that's adopted. And for OEMs, automotive OEMs who want to be global, remember these are massively expensive products to develop. You need the global market to really help justify those investments. This is one of the biggest challenges that OEMs around the world face, because you have different requirements for emissions, you have different requirements for crash standards, you have different requirements for lighting standards, and I can go on. And these add significantly to the cost of producing and distributing vehicles in different markets. And would, by the way, also be a good example. I referenced earlier in my comments of some of the non-tariff barriers that are followed in Japan. Japan has a particularly rigorous set of requirements for vehicles that are to be sold in their market that are geared around the fact that their domestic manufacturers dominate the Japanese market. They have the volumes to do it. For any foreign company that wishes to break in there, even assuming you can overcome the very considerable constraints of access to distribution networks, putting up dealer networks, there's no free land left there. But the cost of homologating vehicles to comply with regulations when you start with a very small volume is quite considerable. And so those are just good practical examples of where there's an incremental cost just through administrative requirements that could also, if we could standardize on these things, dramatically reduce costs and therefore also be to the benefit of consumers around the globe.
Brian, as marketing has evolved just recently, even enabled by technology, one of the things that we talk about with regard to our marketing is content, the content that's in the marketing, and we call it a product. And that product, that marketing product, so whether you're marketing automobiles or consumer products like toothpaste, the method of doing it changes across culture because you have cultural mores that will allow it. Now, you asked for an example, so I'm going to give you one.
Oh.
Calvin Klein. The Calvin Klein advertisement, I was reading this was just yesterday, I was reading a Forbes article online, and this little video box popped up, and there was this very, very provocative video taking place there. And that sort of thing would not work in the Middle East. So that advertisement would not play well there because of the standards that are there. On the other hand, in Italy, in Europe, that would have been a very modest commercial to watch. So, in our business, when we're supporting the products that go out there with the product of marketing, we have to pay attention to what's acceptable over there.
We were both actually in Milan this summer. At the same time, I never met up, but seeing some of the advertisements on the street right next to a church was just a really interesting combination. And it was kind of like, I'm glad my kids, or adults now, aren't with me, because I'd walk around going, no.
Go like this.
Yeah, yeah, that. No, my wife said no.
Oh.
Okay, so given we've had a lot of examples of change in technology, whether it's situations of geofencing as a marketing technique, whether we're looking at Tesla's recent announcement that they're going to sell purely on the internet, and how that may affect other OEMs in the business. But look at the marketing side of it. What's going to be next for marketing and sales technologies? Where are we going with this? What's the future look like?
Well, the future of marketing is really happening right now with one-to-one marketing, where because of geofencing, or what's sometimes referred to as beacon marketing, where if you have an app on your phone and you walk into Nordstrom, Nordstrom knows you're there, and when you walk past the cosmetics counter, you'll get a blurb that you've got, that there's a special pricing on cosmetics. Of course, that means that I've gotten something special just for me from Nordstrom. They're paying attention to me as a consumer, and it's something that we crave. I mean, let's face it, the auto companies are way too over-complexed in building their products now, and the reason is because the marketplace demands 5 different levels of trim on an Explorer. We want to have personalized service, and the technology's enabled that now. Wait,
Oh, go ahead.
I'd like, Johan, will you comment on that?
Uh-oh, here we go.
I was just looking at how much time we have left, because my answer
Oh,
is going to take the rest
sorry.
of it.
You're the moderator.
So I'll try to be really brief. I think that the advent of online shopping is already quite clearly established. And I have often said in conversations with our dealer body that we should not imagine that the switch to online shopping, which has already decimated the big box stores and is leading to empty shopping malls across the world, will somehow not also eventually reach the auto business. And I think that the traditional dealer model, where OEMs demand these big Taj Mahal flagship brand stores located in very expensive real estate and highline areas with a fancy showroom in the front and a huge service warehouse at the back, that's outdated. The structural costs that is associated with that has also reached the point that it is not sustainable. And I will tell you that if your automotive dealers are not profitable, your franchise ultimately also is not sustainable. So now what to do? One thing is also clear, that baby boomers, people of my generation, just in case you thought I was younger, have been displaced in the last 3 years as the primary consumers of automobiles. And so the younger generation are now assuming the ascendancy in terms of purchasing power, and this is going to accelerate. Within a few years, 80% of luxury vehicles already will be purchased by members of Gen X or Gen Y. And they bring with them new shopping behaviors. So online shopping started really in impacting the auto business, interestingly enough, on the used car side. Now, I would have expected it to be on the new car side because new vehicles are undifferentiated. Used cars, each used car is unique, but somehow it didn't develop this way. We already know that most consumers who arrive at a dealership today, sort of at the last step in the purchasing process, arrive there with more knowledge about the product than most of the salespeople on the floor, because they have researched it and they're extremely well informed. What happens next, though? If you look a few years into the future, in a world where we imagine we have fully electrified fleets, EVs require far less maintenance than mechanical internal combustion powered vehicles. And the service part, or the fixed operations part of the business, is in fact the major profit driver for dealers. So if you take that business away, you're a problem. Secondly, if you imagine that we now have cars with autonomous driving capability, why would the customer have to go to the dealership in the first place? Imagine he could order their vehicle, they could configure it online, and the car just delivers itself to their door. And if it needs maintenance, it sends it off to the store to get maintained. So it's not as if that scenario is just around the corner, but it's plausible that it could form part of the future. And if you want to respond to that environment, I think that automotive dealers of the future will probably decouple their fixed operations or the maintenance side of their business from their retail operations. The retail operations will be located in high-value shopping malls and kind of the high-brand, intense malls, and they will be more brand experience centers, not so much about sales. And they'll harness technology to immerse people into the product and demonstrate all the features and benefits. The technical operations of the dealership will be moved into the warehouse districts where rents are far lower and customers will not go there. Now, manufacturers who are wise, I think, will also recognize that they cannot exist without their downstream retail distribution networks. Regardless of whether vehicles are EVs or mechanically powered vehicles, they will always require maintenance. There will be regulatory inspections, there will be recalls. I mean, these are just part of the reality of life. And you need people on the ground to do that, and there will be customers who want that kind of interface with a real life person. The problem, though, is that if you take away the revenue stream that is really driving the profitability of dealers, what are you left with? Because they'll go out of business. And I think a wise manufacturer will relook the revenue sharing model that is applied and move away from just the dealer has his margin and he needs to cope with it, to one where we recognize increasingly that a lot of value will be coming from downstream services, over-the-air updates, and this kind of benefit. That revenue has to be shared with the dealer, even though the dealer didn't actively form part of that process. But then also, if you imagine an electrification world, EVs are far simpler to, in fact, build and construct than complex mechanical vehicles. That explains partially why there are so many startups in the EV space, because the barriers to entry are profoundly lower. OEMs also, however, like to keep things simple in their manufacturing environment. And you referenced that we want 6 different versions of an Explorer. I will tell you they want 248 different versions of a luxury car. It's the reality of life. Customers want individualization. And there's always this trade-off between the need to satisfy customer expectations and managing complexity in the plants. So one scenario for the future could well be, in an EV world where the cars are relatively simple, you have a skateboard. So it's the base of the car that contains the batteries and the motors and the suspension components and all the critical crash structures. And that forms the basis of the vehicle, and you now put different hats on to turn them into, from sedans into SUVs, into convertibles, or into delivery vehicles, whatever the case might be. And so this lends itself to a world where you could well imagine that the manufacturer develops and engineers and designs a range of vehicles, but chooses to manufacture itself only a specific subset that are relatively highly standardized and meet the needs of 80% of the market. And they outsource to their dealer network the ability to customize vehicles and to build low-volume individual entry models using the kits that have been designed by the OEM, shipped and installed, because dealer workshops kind of lend themselves to a batch manufacturing process. It doesn't have to be an assembly line. And that way you can harness the infrastructure that already exists, you can provide a part of the revenue stream to your dealers, and you can provide the flexibility that particularly high-end consumers demand while maintaining high volume, simplified production complexity in your own plants. That's a conceivable part of what the future could look like.
So you can see how my OEM customer here can give us suppliers migraines. Low volumes, multiple locations, headache. I'll give you one good example of how this sort of stuff trickles down to us. We built a plant a few years ago, again in China, for an OEM who wanted to have an all-wheel drive transfer case. So we built the plant. The first year production was 10% of what the volume that they'd given us. Second year was 20%. We were losing money hand over fist. If you do your root cause analysis of what happened, they assumed that the worldwide trend towards all-wheel drive, which in the last 3 to 5 years has been huge in North America and then later in Europe, they just assumed that would transfer to China. Well, it didn't. And they didn't do any advertising. They didn't get into the heads of the Chinese consumer why they needed an all-wheel drive. And in China, you don't have that as much snow in the premium vehicle areas that you would have in North America and Europe. You don't have an automatic need for that. You don't have a lot of off-road driving. As I mentioned, you've got a lot of people, owners that sit in the back of the vehicle. Why do they need all-wheel drive? Yeah. So they didn't do their homework, and they didn't get the information into the hands of the consumer. The consumer now is insatiable for information, and that will drive a lot of what Johan talked about, in terms of changing the whole structure of how vehicles are supplied.
So also to this point, when we speak about outsourcing, it's not just a matter of outsourcing component manufacturing to our suppliers. As you hear, we also outsource the headaches.
Very well.
So if you look at this, how the automotive industry originally began, coming full circle of this variety of items and variety of add-ons and colors, back to Henry Ford's famous quote, "You can have any color you want as long as it's black." So we have really come full circle in how much we actually supply. One of the issues we haven't really hit yet, the concept of major trade agreements. Where do you think, what's your estimate of where they're going to head in the future, since we are involved in trade agreements discussions right now with China, and Europe will probably be next. And since we're on trade agreements, the Brexit issue and how that affects trade agreements and where we're going with that. So just general trade agreements.
I like to leave the difficult questions for my co-panelists.
Well, I would only say that, I feel optimistic that we can work out. I just am glass half full when it comes to our world. And I'm hoping that we can arrive at something with China, that will be workable, that Wall Street will respond to, that people will feel comfortable putting new plants overseas and that sort of thing. Japan has taken a little bit different tack. I have to be careful because my wife is Japanese, so I'm going to be very careful right here. But Japan has sort of kicked the can down the road, and as they kind of have been known to do, we'll deal with this later. And we're in talks right now with Japan about trade, so we'll see how that works out. But it's kind of a time of reckoning for us to right-side things, and it'll be interesting as students of our economy and of our world and marketing and business in general to see how things come about.
I'm still on a board in China, a foreign enterprise board, and 2 years ago, the chairman of the board, who was also the chairman of SAIC, came in a little bit late for the meeting, but he was very happy. He said that the Shanghai government had just approved his 30-year plan. So when you think of trade spats and so on, and trade agreements, you got to remember that the Chinese in particular have a very, very long-term view. And that will, I think, make them amenable to an agreement in the short-term future. But we need to be thinking in 30 years or 20 years. Japan has always had a very long-term view. So I think, everybody needs to step back and have a longer-term perspective over these agreements.
Yeah, I think it's probably fair to say that common sense leaves the room the minute politicians enter it. But nonetheless, there's a need for coexistence, and I concur. I think pragmatically, the Chinese already are seeing the impact on their own economy coming from this dispute. Whether it will be resolved to the ultimate extent that perhaps our trade negotiators today are working towards remains to be seen. I do think that we will get a more level playing field, if not totally level, which is already a good start. But I think we also have to acknowledge this is not just an issue of the Chinese and Europeans having trade barriers. If you'll pardon the expression, I mean, the United States is also not holier than the Pope. We have barriers as well. One that's kind of probably not that well known, but is well known in the auto business, is the barriers to trucks coming into the US. Hence the example of the chairs or the seats being in the, there are substantial barriers to entry, and probably we should expect that we have to give up some ground as well. But ultimately, I think that the next 10 years is going to bring about an environment where there is a more equal playing field. And we should also not lose sight of the fact, you know, we tend to speak only of finished goods. America is massively dominant in the services industry and the export of those intellectual property-driven things. So there are other people who also are concerned about the impact of the Googles and the Apples of this world. And that leveling of the playing field also will, I think, reverberate and have an impact in the future.
Since we have a lot of students in the audience, how should business schools better prepare students entering business and entering global businesses that operate in the global market? Answer one, we have these events. That's my first answer. But what else should we be doing? What else should business schools be doing to help prepare students to enter that global market?
You know, I don't mind to take that one perhaps first, primarily because it is something that I personally have worked quite hard to promote. And we have in our audience here somebody who was an intern at one of the companies I ran. I think that you could work a lot harder approaching big organizations who are involved in the global business to create internships and sort of a practical experience as almost a mandatory part of the curriculum. And several months of sort of hands-on experience and getting exposed to the topics that are discussed at, you know, if not boardroom level, at least senior management level, to get the perspectives of, you know, the broad picture as opposed to just stuff that's related to one particular task, I think is an important developmental opportunity and could equip the students better with a better understanding of the practical application of the theoretical concepts that are taught at the school.
Yeah, I think, you know, the biggest thing you can learn at a business school or any school is how to ask questions. You know, you're not going to get all the answers, but you've got to know how to ask the right questions. And if you look at due diligence, what is due diligence but a list of questions? You go into international markets, you got to have your list of questions. So I think that further to what Johan said, you know, maybe you can come to us and ask us, you know, what are your problems? What is the first level, and then have the brainstorming sessions in the school that pose the problem to get down. As Toyota's got a very, very good analysis system, and you should look it up on the internet. Very simple, 5 why. Ask why 5 times to get to the root cause of something. If you can teach people that we've got a lot of problems are not something you know, that are to be scary monsters in the night. They're something to be looked at and explored, and everything boils down to more questions. So the mental, analytical ability to ask questions, and we've got live examples every day passed on by our esteemed customers. So, you know, ask us what our questions are, and you know, divide your classes into teams and have them assess them. And then we can come in and tell you whether we solved the problem or not, or you know, what our approach is.
Yeah. I think it's also really important, you know, these internships should not be regarded as vacation jobs. These are part of a learning experience. And, you know, a good way to make that happen is to give the students an assignment, an actual real work problem that they need to go and investigate, understand, and develop proposals for a solution and come and present to top management. You need to take out the time to give these interns an audience. It's something I've advocated strongly in the companies I've worked in, and I really do believe in that.
In the audience is a good friend of mine, Mike Callahan, who directs our employment internship, and you may want to meet Mike afterwards and share your ideas with him. He's over there right now beaming.
He paid me $5 to say this, by the way.
We see a lot of other countries transplant manufacturing operations within the U.S. Do you see China developing more of a footprint in manufacturing, especially in the auto industry, within the U.S.? OEMs.
I think initially the entries into the U.S. and other important global markets will be sourcing vehicles produced in China. They will go through exactly the same business decisions that every other company does. Do you need to set up a new factory? Do you need to tool up? And probably the conventional model tends to dictate that you enter a market, you export the vehicles, you build up a level of brand awareness, a customer base, a retail distribution network, and you grow your business until you get to critical mass that justifies local assembly. And that's likely to be the avenue that's followed, which will probably mean that you will see Chinese vehicles being produced in the long term in the US. I also will tell you that the Chinese government, to the centrally planned economy, has one of their strategic objectives that China should take leadership in vehicle electrification globally. And if that objective is attained, I will tell you that the status quo in the auto business has been turned on its head. The companies who dominate from the US, from Europe, from Japan, Korea, they could well be supplanted now by Chinese brands.
Yeah, I mean, if you ask the question, I mean, what is their number one objective? The number one objective right now is employment. And automotive is the biggest employer. There's nobody that equates to how many people one automotive plant employs and then down to the supply chain. So right now they're employing people, so they don't need to export. And they've got an expanding market. The market has been expanding for double digits for 15, 20 years. But they have a long-term plan. In 10 years, will that change? Absolutely.
You know, one thing we also remember is that back in our day, you bought from the big three, and if you didn't, someone would put a key across the pane of your car. This generation doesn't respond to that. We buy what we want. And so to the extent that the Chinese are able to bring over the vehicle content, the performance, pipe in the nifty sound so it sounds like an 8-cylinder used to sound, but it still gets 30 miles per gallon. To the extent that they're able to hit that buy button with the customer, to resonate with that customer, and that customer will communicate their love for that product to other friends, there will be a market here for Chinese cars and other products. And that's not easy.
Recently, the U.S. is changing its support of electrical vehicles by eliminating the credit, the tax credit. How is that elimination affecting the electric vehicle market?
Well, it's giving an advantage to China because the Chinese government wants to dominate the industry. So the volume right down the supply chain for electric vehicles is going to be with suppliers who are based in China, whether they be local or overseas. You're going to have much smaller. The U.S. is going to be definitely the smallest market of the three big ones: China, Europe, and U.S.
So just think about the implications of this. If you're an OEM and you have to invest so heavily into electrification in the development of the vehicles, and then you need to invest into the plants to produce them, and your largest market is China by regulatory requirements, where are you going to put up your plants? You're going to put them there. And then you're probably going to export from there. And so the absence of an ability to grow the volume in the US because of the financial barriers, the cost barriers. The EVs are still more expensive to produce and therefore to own or purchase than an internal a conventional vehicle. That will mean that you actually are tipping the playing field in the long run. And the purpose of the incentives, there's a lot of debate. It's like, why would you use taxpayer money to provide credits to the affluent, who are the people who are buying these EVs? Well, it's a good question. But on the other hand, it is also an emerging technology that we all know. I don't think there's anybody in the room who would argue that the long-term future of the automobile must look at zero emissions. Whether it's EVs or fuel cells is a moot point. But in order to justify the investment and to promote adoption of these, you need to get it to critical mass. And therefore, these subsidies are strategic plays to help facilitate the growth and development of that competence. The Chinese are doing it and we aren't. Guess where water flows? It flows downhill.
Okay. One last question. Global sales strategies. How are they going to change in the next 5 years to meet demands out there? How are we going to change our structure to continue to compete with the rest of the world? Or do we need to?
I'm going to leave that to the marketer.
Once again, I think the more we've changed, the more we're the same. When it comes to, I wonder if Frank would chime in on this too. When it comes to a deal, it's still about sending one of your executives across the pond to shake a hand and to make the deal happen, and then to go back and put things together in your home turf. Technologies enable that, of course, by making us not have to make the trip. The airlines also support that by giving us an awful trip when we use the airlines, but that's my thought about that. I think that's one of those high-touch industries that we won't be able to get around. I used to say in my class 20 years ago when I started, there's two things that we will always have in the job market. We'll have salespeople and we'll have truck drivers. Well, now I'm not so sure about truck drivers because we have autonomous trucks coming pretty soon. But I think we'll always have salespeople. That one I'm sticking to. So.
Okay. Just as you take your turn at the mic, any final thoughts you want as the most important part of today's discussion?
Well, I think I can answer both questions with one answer, and that is that, people, and we've talked a lot about the flashy side of marketing, the branding and consumer behavior, all that sort of stuff. But, for the supplier, and I think also for others in the industry, the key thing in the next 5 years is going to be intelligence and processing information. Because, as Johan said, the consumers have got a huge amount of choice. And we're going to have to, as suppliers, try to determine how the consumer choice manifests itself in the volumes. Because we are mass manufacturers, so we've got to get a return on our capital. So we've got to read the tea leaves a lot more. So the speed at which we can gather information and process information and differentiate trends in different countries so that we don't make mistakes with capital. And if you make, as a supplier, you make a mistake with your capital investment, it can really mortally injure you. So you've got to have intelligent decision making and decide where to put the plant for which product that's going to give you the payback over a 10-year period. And that is becoming more and more difficult. So, we need people in this room to have skills of business analytical skills that can tap into big data, can help us become more efficient, I mean, the age of the spreadsheet is over. You've got to be able to process data much quicker. And our whole industry is in the business, the supply industry is in the process of trying to change to being able to process huge amounts of data in more advanced systems and faster and provide information. And we're going to have to be better as managers trying to interpret the data.
So I think it's clear that technology is now the big disruptor. It's changing how consumers shop. It's changing, again, in the automotive space, this convergence of advances in connectivity, electrification, autonomous capability, and the rise of the megacities. We haven't even actually really touched on that today. More and more consumers are being packed into the megacities around the world. And living in New York, I can really relate to the massive barriers to personal vehicle ownership that exist. And this is becoming more widespread around the world. At the same time, millennials are less inclined to want to purchase cars. They don't get excited by them anymore the way we used to. And this is changing the whole face of the concept of individual or personal mobility. And that impacts how people want to own and operate cars. I mean, if you look at it as a continuum, where the one bookend is the conventional way of writing out a check and buying the car and park it into your garage for 94% of the time unutilized, whereas the other bookend is probably vehicle ownership by individual journey, like an Uber ride, and then all the other manifestations in between. And in this world, I would say that branding is going to become more important than ever for automotive OEMs. Because if the consumers are becoming brand agnostic, which they are, if they want to consume individual mobility by ride because there are huge barriers to entry to conventional vehicle ownership, there is the real risk. If you now consider this in conjunction with electrification, if you're an OEM, do you decide to invest billions now into developing battery chemistry and cell technology, knowing that there's no single OEM on this earth that has more investment power than the combined investment power and resource of the total supply base? So you could invest in your own battery and suddenly find there's a new technological breakthrough which renders your entire investment obsolete. So you can then decide, well, I will outsource the risk and the headaches to the suppliers and I will just source from them. That, in effect, also changes the whole relationship between OEM and supplier, because it now actually moves your tier one suppliers into a dominant position because they own all the technology and the IP, and the OEMs merely become assemblers. So you may say, well, so what? Well, I'll tell you, so what? What happens now if the consumer tastes move along and the Ubers and Lyfts of this world and the Didis and all of these ride-sharing companies become ubiquitous and all-powerful? And consumers increasingly are interested only in getting from A to B. They don't care how. Well, it doesn't take a leap of the imagination to imagine a world then where Uber designs their vehicle and their specification, and the OEMs who are not strong on brands become reduced to the role of being a contract manufacturer. And that, I will tell you, is the worst possible scenario because there's no money in hardware. The money is downstream of the hardware. And so if you can protect the integrity of your brand and continue to build the appeal, that intangible brand appeal, it captures the loyalty of customers and helps OEMs to potentially protect themselves against some of these potentially negative implications that I've articulated.
Okay. I would like to thank Johan, Frank, and Chris for contributing their time to our panel today. I'd also like to thank Murray Feldman with WWJ 950 for partnering with us this year. A couple of thanks to our students' assistants, Gail Reeves, who keeps me out of trouble and tells me where to go, Michael Kamen and Adam over there, and you, the audience, for showing up today. We've had over 850 people at our 3 events this year, quite successful. Actually, our next event starting off next season would be October 10th, Thursday, October 10th. And we're looking at cybersecurity and basically the theory of zero trust. And we'll see you in October. Thank you.